Welcome to Parenti Stuff, the podcast. I am your host, Lumpy Louise, and this is the read and discuss of Democracy for the Few, 9th edition. Chapter 3, The Rise of a Corporate State. So what I'm doing here is I've been doing by chapters, Democracy for the Few. I do have... We may switch it over and have them go up on Collective, but for right now, I have a YouTube account for Parenti Stuff, and the videos that I've been doing are going to go up there. I did not put up 2 yet. That was on Tuesday. I just didn't have a chance yesterday, and today I was working on this. So over the weekend, I have Chapter 1 up already. Well, Chapter 2 and Chapter 3 will go up this weekend, and yeah, so I'll have those up on the YouTube so you can rewatch if you missed any of it. So basically what I do is the format that we did for Late Nights with Lennon, which turned to, Sundays with Lennon turned to Late Nights, and then it turned to Lit with Lennon. We are going to begin on historically, we're going to be doing the Lit with Lennon again. So the style that we do it in is kind of like a read and discuss. You're discussing as you read. I've had people come up here, and if you ever want to come up, you can request while I'm doing these things. Usually at the end, we can have a big discussion and I'll let you up. But I go through and I do some, talk like my own comments on it. And then I play like a section of the text. So tonight we're talking, from Democracy for the Few. We are at Chapter 3, The Rise of the Corporate State. Okay. So Parenti talks about struggles of workers under industrialization in the United States, which were made worse by the fact that the government was always on the side of the wealthy, and those early year capitalists were lousy with wealth and getting lousier. All right. So for me, like labor history has been it's always something that I loved, like reading, because I love the fight. I love that spirit of the revolution and stuff like that. Like, so in the United States, I have Black Panthers, I can read that stuff. And then I have labor history. So, I always enjoyed that. But I just want to say, however, it's not an easy history, especially since it includes not only the government going to war with its own people in the labor wars, but the history of chattel slavery and the continued and once again heightened genocide of the indigenous people of Turtle Island. So Chapter 3 is all about, after the Jeffersonian, you're going into the Jacksonian era and stuff like that. So that I want to talk about some differences that was happening right around then. So you have the Jeffersonian versus Jacksonian democracy. So, and there's a hint that neither are very democratic, just so you know. The Jeffersonian period goes from the writing of the Constitution about 1787 to the mid 1820s. And then Jackson takes office in 1829, and that begins the Jacksonian era of democracy, supposedly. And that goes through from 1829 to 1854. So in the beginning, there was Hamilton's Federalist Party and Jefferson's Democratic Republicans, split among the Jeffersonians. And what would become the modern Democratic Party formed around Andrew Jackson. The Republicans came a little later in 1854 when the Whigs and the Free Soil Party merged to become the party supporting Lincoln. All right, so Jefferson favored the old ways, he loved the agrarian, and then the maritime commerce, so that, he didn't really push for industrialization. Jackson supported industrialization. Okay. So both men favored a weaker federal government. However, Jackson didn't want that extended to the executive branch. So he, basically the branch that he was in. So he wanted to have the power in that. He wanted a weaker Congress and stuff like that, but, for him to have the power. Jefferson pushed for public education, at least for white boys and men, and Jackson was against public education at all. He didn't believe in it. Jackson is made out to be the man of the people, but his actions said differently. He had to look like he was pushing for the working man because they were becoming a problem with the quickly growing labor force, and we'll get into that in a later down the chapter. Jefferson believed in a natural aristocracy that would emerge out of like his own class to rule over the people. You don't want to, have those rabble there and stuff like that, right? You don't want them having any say over what happens. The people don't know what's good for them, I guess. So Jackson used the spoil system to fill his administration. So the spoil system is that Jackson favored was just, we call it cronyism. It came from the phrase, to the victors go the spoils. A lot of people attribute this practice to Jackson directly, but it was happening before. It's happened, plenty of times since. But the practice was supposedly phased out in 1883 with the Pendleton Act, but there are definitely times nepotism and patronage is still in play in our political system, so it didn't really get rid of it. I also want to note before we listen to... I'm going to also note that the Christianity starts being pushed by the capitalists kind of in the Jacksonian. It comes a little bit more after, after the Civil War. But you have like Rockefeller has famously kept, even as a kid, he would like give money to the church and stuff like that. And he kept journals of everything he ever gave in charity. He kept a journal of like his whole life. And so they wore their charity as a moralistic armor to protect against their detractors. So the capitalists, starting in the Jacksonian time, started pushing towards a Christian state more so than the politicians themselves, which explains why the politicians did it, because, of course, they're trying to please the capitalists. I want to read just a couple of paragraphs from Martin Glaberman, writing as Martin Harvey. So full disclosure, as I'm getting into this, I don't know if there's any Trotskys here, but Martin actually was a young Trotskyist. But he kind of left them and he was more like in the Union. He was a socialist and stuff like that. So what he wrote on was always like labor history stuff. So give me 1 second. Let me pull this up so I'm looking at. Okay, so the piece is called The Age of Jackson. It was written in April of 1946. He's talking about Schlesinger, which is, Schlesinger is brought up a lot by like even Parenti. Zinn brings him up. A lot of the people that are, writing on any sense of history at this time, like Schlesinger was writing history, early in the 19th century on to like mid. So they were looking at him and what he was writing, but he's a liberal and he's one of those, gentleman historians, as Parenti calls them. So he writes, the metamorphosis of conservatism revived it politically, but ruined it intellectually. The Federalists had thought about society in an intelligent and hard-boiled way. Their ideas had considerable relevance to the conflicts and tensions of the life around them. But the Whigs, in scuttling federalism, replaced it by a social philosophy founded not on ideas, but on subterfuges and sentimentalities. So then what Glaberman has to say about this, he says, his praise of the Federalist is entirely justified. The great Federalist statesmen, Hamilton, Madison, and others, had a dearest picture of capitalist society. He's saying that this is a little sarcastic too. The Federalist Papers written by Hamilton, Jay, and Madison could well rank as a textbook on the nature of the state. Even the Jeffersonians of the day, although with less theoretical clarity, presented a valid picture of capitalist society. With the first Jackson campaign, however, there was indication and tendency towards the brawling, meaningless political campaigns that soon characterized American politics, a tendency that was completed in the Whig campaign of 1840, in which William Henry Harrison was swept into office on the slogans of hard cider, my Bostonian just came out, hard cider and a log cabin, and Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Okay, so why this change? Was it caused by the intellectual degeneration of the leading politicians? Not at all. There is an excellent and practical reason for the change: the rise of the working class. And this is what I wanted to get into, because this is what Parenti is getting into in this chapter. At the dawn of capitalism, when the only serious antagonist to the capitalist class is reactionary feudalism, which was a threat on the American continent, the rulers can afford to speak the truth. With the growth of the working class in numbers and the development of its organizations, there rises the instrument for their overthrow. From this comes the desperate need to hide the real nature of capitalism, to bury the truth beneath subterfuges and sentimentalities. It is no coincidence, therefore, that the Jacksonian period, which witnessed the remarkable growth of the American working class and its powerful intrusion on the national scene, should also be the period in which demagoguery and bribery should first establish their uninterrupted rule in American politics. So, so the politicians and the capitalists had to, they were seeing the rising working class, and they were asking for things, and they had to curb the working class. But as we all know, it's the working class that gave us, it's the slaves gave us pretty much built the country, but the working class, which, in this, you can include slaves because the labor was on slaves too. They're laboring in mines at this time and tobacco fields and all that, the cotton and everything that was making money for the industrialists. So they're all included in this too. All right, so let me start. Hold on. Let me start chapter 3. If I can get in here. Get to chapter 3. All right. So I'll be back in a few minutes.
3. Rise of the corporate state. Contrary to what is commonly taught, the history of the United States has been marked by intense and often violent labor struggles, with the government playing a partisan role in these conflicts, mostly on the side of big business. The war against labor. The upper-class dominance of public life, so characteristic of the Founding Fathers' generation, continued throughout the 19th century. As early as 1816, Thomas Jefferson complained of an aristocracy of our moneyed corporations which bid defiance to the laws of our country. In the 1830s, the period of Jacksonian democracy, supposedly the era of the common man, President Andrew Jackson's key appointments were drawn overwhelmingly from the ranks of the rich, and his policies regarding trade, finances, and the use of government lands reflected the interests of wealthy investors. In an address before the mechanics and working classes, in 1827, a worker lamented, "We find ourselves oppressed on every hand. We labor hard in producing all the comforts of life for the enjoyment of others, while we ourselves obtain but a scanty portion." In 1845 in New York, Baltimore, New Orleans, St. Louis, and other urban centers, the richest 1% owned the lion's share of the wealth, while a third of the population was utterly destitute. Poverty and overcrowding brought cholera and typhoid epidemics, causing the wealthy to flee the cities, while the poor, having nowhere to go and no way to get there even if they did, stayed and died. Living in misery, many impoverished people were addicted to alcohol and drugs. Children as young as 9 and 10 toiled 14-hour shifts, falling asleep at the machines they tended, suffering from malnutrition and sickness. During these industrial conflicts, Native Americans struggled valiantly against the expropriation of their lands and the systematic slaughter of their people, a process that began with the earliest 17th century European settlements and continued through the 18th and most of the 19th centuries, ending with the tribal remnants being confined to desolate, impoverished reservations. Large landowners and corporations profited greatly from slave labor. Slaves were used to lay railroads, construct oil lines, harvest tobacco and cotton, and dig for coal, salt, and marble. Insurance companies sold policies to slaveholders for their human property. Emancipation did not bring liberation to all persons held in servitude. For more than 60 years, well into the 20th century, hundreds of thousands of indigent African Americans were forced to toil at construction sites, railroads, mines, and large farms under slave labor conditions. Arrested for trivial offenses such as gambling or foul language, they had to work off the inflated costs of their keep, which they invariably were unable to do. Subjected to whippings and torture, unsafe work conditions, and wretched food and housing, tens of thousands perished. One of the biggest users of this convict slave labor was a subsidiary of U.S. Steel Corporation. The corporate struggle against labor in 19th century America, with its farmers' rebellions and massive rail and industrial strikes, was as fierce as any in the industrial world. Civil authorities intervened almost invariably on the side of the owning class to quell disturbances and crush strikes. State and federal courts branded labor combinations as conspiracies against private property and the Constitution. Throughout the 19th century and well into the 20th, police, militia, company thugs, and federal troops attacked strikers and other protesters, killed hundreds, and injured and jailed thousands more. In 1886, police in Chicago's Haymarket Square killed at least 20 demonstrators, while wounding some 200 in response to a thrown bomb that killed 7 police. 4 anarchist leaders, none of whom had been present, were tried and hanged for having printed appeals some days earlier that supposedly inspired the incident. That same year, 35 striking African-American sugar workers were massacred in Thibodaux, Louisiana, by a militia detachment composed of the town's affluent citizens. The 2 strike leaders were dragged from jail and lynched. In 1892, Pinkerton gun thugs hired by a steel company killed 9 striking steel workers in Homestead, Pennsylvania. The strike was eventually broken by the National Guard. In 1894, U.S. Army troops killed 34 railroad workers who were among those on strike against the Pullman Company. Over the next few years, scores of striking coal miners were murdered. In the infamous Ludlow Massacre of 1914, Colorado National Guardsmen fired into a tent colony of miners who were on strike against a Rockefeller-owned company, killing 40, including 2 women and 11 children. In 1919, faced with a general strike that began in Seattle and spread elsewhere, the U.S. Attorney General arrested more than 100,000 workers in 70 cities across the nation. That same year in Arkansas, over 100 striking cotton pickers were massacred by U.S. troops and an armed contingent of the town's most prosperous citizens. In 1915, sheriff's deputies in Everett, Washington, killed 11 and wounded 27 members of the industrial workers of the world who were protesting restrictions on free speech. In 1932, Henry Ford's private police fired upon unemployed factory workers, killing 4 and wounding 24. In 1937, the Chicago police fired upon a peaceful crowd of striking steel workers, killing 10 and wounding over 40. An additional 6 strikers were killed on picket lines in Ohio. As even this incomplete list suggests, the forces of law and order were repeatedly utilized to suppress organized labor. The industrial barons regularly called state militia and federal soldiers to their assistance. Short of having the regular army permanently garrisoned in industrial areas, as was the desire of some wealthy owners, government officials took steps to establish an effective anti-radical National Guard. 8.
All right, so that was section 1 called The War Against Labor. Thank you everyone who has been joining. That was just section 1 we got through on Democracy for the Few, chapter 3, the section 1, which is called The War Against Labor. So in the first paragraph, Parenti talks about how Jackson filled his appointments from the ranks of the rich and that he made policy to help the wealthy investors. And my brain thought of Germany 1933 and how that leader made his way up pretending to be for the people, but every move he made was in support of the capitalists. Also, remember from chapter 2 that the backbone of this country, the Constitution, was a document written by a group of white, wealthy, self-serving men. There is no way they would actually let someone rule that tipped the scales for the people. Also, want to note that when the anti-Semitic Nuremberg laws were created in Germany in the 1930s, the United States racist laws were looked at and praised as being the one state that made progress towards the type of racist order the Nuremberg laws were trying to establish. There are 3 main groups of oppression that are talked about during this time period that, we're talking about the Jacksonian. So you have, and the women now kind of hit into that workers a lot more. Women are moving more and more into working into factories and stuff like that. So the women are in the workers, and then you have the enslaved people who were exploited through their labor. And then the way the capitalists exploited the indigenous was by violently removing them from their lands and utilizing those lands to extract the raw materials using the labor of the other two groups. I'll note here that though Jackson began the Indian Removal Act, that was that the worst of it, the Trail of Tears, was actually done under his successor, Van Buren. That is not to say that this doesn't fall under the evils that Jackson did, because he paved the way for that trail. The fact that we never really got rid of slavery and had made a pipeline that works against Black people the most, but also indigenous and people of color more than the majority white race, should convince enough people that the system is biased in favor of white people. But sadly, people have been convinced that the law and order put upon them by the ruling class is just, no matter who the is just, no matter who the laws end up being applied to disproportionately. I'm reading my own notes. So sometimes I get my own notes wrong. All right, so in this section, Parenti mentions another form of slavery, which still impacts the Black population in this country much more than any other groups. The slavery being used from prisons, and how the U.S. Steel Corporation benefited greatly from that. I want to read to you a story from the book entitled Slavery by Another Name, published in 2008. It was written by Douglas A. Blackmon, who is a journalist that wanted to look at American corporations in the same light as we looked at the German ones that benefited from the concentration camps. I'm going to note here, beyond what I read here, the few paragraphs that I'll read to you, Blackmon writes he's like a liberal media writer, like Washington Post and that stuff. So he kind of just looks at this like as it was the past. Like he like, if you read this book, he kind of doesn't talk about, like, I don't know. I only read the first part of it, so maybe he gets into it later. But even with some of the stuff he was writing, it sounded kind of like he was, not really saying it's happening now. So hold on one second. I just have to look at this on my bigger screen. Okay. So from the book, Slavery by Another Name, this is right in the introduction. On March 30th, 1908, Green Cottenham was arrested by the sheriff of Shelby County, Alabama, and charged with vagrancy. Cottenham had committed no true crime. Vagrancy, the offense of a person not being able to prove at a given moment that he or she is employed, was a new and flimsy concoction dredged up from legal obscurity at the end of the 19th century by the state legislatures of Alabama and other southern states. It was capriciously enforced by local sheriffs and constables, adjudicated by mayors and notaries public, recorded haphazardly or not at all by court records, and most tellingly, in a time of massive unemployment among all Southern men, was reserved almost exclusively for Black men. Cottenham's offense was blackness. After 3 days behind bars, 22-year-old Cottenham was found guilty in a swift appearance before the county judge and immediately sentenced to a 30-day term of hard labor. Unable to pay the array of fees assessed on every prisoner, fees to the sheriff, the deputy, the court clerk, the witnesses, paying the witness, Cottenham's sentence was extended to nearly a year of hard labor. The next day, Cottenham, the youngest of 9 children born to former slaves in an adjoining county, was sold under a standing arrangement between the county and the vast subsidiary of the industrial titan of the North, U.S. Steel Corporation. So just to note, too, the Rockefellers are still highly involved in the U.S. Steel Corporation at this time, so they're making money off of this. So the sheriff turned the young man over to the company for the duration of his sentence. In return, the subsidiary, Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company, gave the county $12 a month to pay off Cottenham's fine and fees. What the company's managers did with Cottenham and thousands of other black men they purchased from sheriffs across Alabama was entirely up to them. A few hours later, the company plunged Cottenham into the darkness of the mine called Slope Number 12, one shaft in a vast subterranean labyrinth on the edge of Birmingham known as Pratt Mines. There he was chained inside a long wooden barrack at night and required to spend nearly every waking hour digging and loading coal. His required daily task was to remove 8 tons of coal from the mine. Cottenham was subject to the whip for failure to dig the requisite amount. At risk of physical torture for disobedience and the lightless catacombs of Black Rock, packed with hundreds of desperate men, slick with sweat and coated in pulverized coal, must have exceeded any vision of hell a boy born in the countryside of Alabama, even a child of slaves, could have ever imagined. Waves of disease ripped through the population. In the month before Cottenham arrived at the prison mine, pneumonia and tuberculosis sickened dozens. Within his first 4 weeks, 6 died. Before the year was over, almost 60 men forced into Slope 12 were dead of disease, accidents, or homicide. Most of the broken bodies, along with hundreds of others before and after, were dumped into shallow graves scattered among the refuse of the mine. Others were incinerated in nearby ovens used to blast millions of tons of coal brought to the surface into coke. The carbon-rich fuel essential to U.S. Steel's production of iron 45 years after President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation freeing American slaves, Green Cottenham and more than 1,000 other black men toiled under the lash at Slope 12, imprisoned in what was then the most advanced city of the South, guarded by whipping bosses, employed by the most iconic example of the modern corporation emerging in the Gilded North. They were slaves in all but name. So, that once again, that is from, the book is called, sorry, now I'm looking back at Slavery by Another Name. So give me 1 second. I'm going to start section 2.
Favors for business. The same federal government that was unable to stop the illegal slave trade and the violence perpetrated against abolitionists was able to comb the land with bands of federal marshals to capture fugitive slaves and return them to their masters. The same government that could not find the constitutional means to eliminate contaminated foods and befouled water supplies could use federal troops to break strikes, shoot hundreds of workers, and slaughter thousands of Native Americans. The same government that had not a dollar for the indigent gave away 21 million acres of land and $51 million in government bonds to a few railroad magnates. And statutes intended to outlaw monopolies and trade conspiracies were rarely used except against labor unions. While insisting that competition worked best for all, most business people showed little inclination to deliver themselves to the exacting imperatives of an untrammeled free market. Instead, they resorted to ruthless business practices to squeeze out competitors. So by the 1890s, John D. Rockefeller Standard Oil controlled roughly 80% of the U.S. oil market. At the same time, the big corporations gorged themselves at the public trough, battening on fat government contracts, subsidies, land grants, and protective tariffs. The Constitution makes no mention of corporations. For the first few decades of the new nation, corporate charters were issued sparingly for specific purposes and fixed periods, usually of 20 or 30 years. Corporations could not own stock in other corporations or any land beyond what they needed for their business. Corporate records were open to public scrutiny, and state legislatures limited the rates that corporations could charge. In time, with the growing power of the business class, all such democratic controls were eliminated, and corporations emerged as powers unto themselves. Using the law of eminent domain, the government took land from farmers and gave it to canal and railroad companies. The idea of a fair price and safe product for consumers was replaced with the doctrine of caveat emptor. Workers were killed or maimed in unsafe work conditions, without employers being held liable. By the late 19th century, millions of dollars collected by the government, from the consuming population, and above all from their poor wage earners and farmers, constituting an enormous budget surplus, was doled out to big investors. Likewise, 1 billion acres of public land, property of the American people, constituting almost half the present continental United States, was privatized. This benevolent government handed over to its friends or to astute first-comers all those treasures of coal and oil, of copper and gold and iron, the land grants, the terminal sites, the perpetual rights of way, an act of largesse which is still one of the wonders of history. The Tariff Act of 1864 was in itself a sheltering wall of subsidies, and to aid further the new heavy industries and manufactures, an Immigration Act allowing contract labor to be imported freely was quickly enacted, a national banking system was perfected. In regard to the needs of the common people, however, the government remained laissez-faire, giving little attention to poverty, unemployment, unsafe work conditions, child labor, and the spoliation of natural resources. Yet democratic struggle persisted. A women's suffrage movement gathered strength. In pursuit of a living wage and decent work conditions, labor unions repeatedly regrouped their shattered ranks to fight pitched battles against the industrial moguls. One important victory was the defeat of their Southern slaveocracy in the Civil War and the abolition of legalized slavery. During Reconstruction, the former Confederate states were put under federal military occupation. The new state government set up in the South by the U.S. Congress decreed universal suffrage for males of all races and incomes, along with popular assemblies, fairer taxes, schools for the poor, and some limited land reform. But once the northern capitalists allied themselves with the southern oligarchs and put an end to Reconstruction, better to face their joint struggles against laborious and farmers, most of these democratic gains were rolled back, not to be recouped until well into the next century, if then. African Americans struggled in the decades after Reconstruction to rise above the cusp of poverty, only to meet malevolent defeat in crushing waves of terrorism and repeated violence at the hands of whites of all classes.
Okay, so Parenti begins this section called Favors for Business, pointing out all the things that we are told to believe our government is and is not capable of accomplishing, and it is always skewed in the favor of capitalists. The closer capitalism ran on a free market, the more monopolies popped up. I have a clip of Parenti talking about how in 1890 was probably like the closest we ever got to a free market. And we can look at the history of 1890 and how much people were suffering in what was going on there, and how much money the capitalists were making during that time. The corporation of old days were no longer. The new ones emerging in the 1820s were ruthless and figured ways around any rule or regulation put on them. And they do that still to this very day. And remember how that phrase, pursuit of happiness, was a stand-in for property? Apparently, the government could just come in and take it for projects they deemed necessary. Who cared if it enriched one of their pals? So, they were just taking away property. They wrote the Constitution, really, saying, you all deserve property. Everyone should get property. But, they'll take it away if they need to throw a railroad on your land. One last note. I saw a comment about people claiming Parenti doesn't source enough. I'm seeing a lot, of course I'm searching Parenti more and I see this comment. I'm like, what are you talking about? Because that last book that I read from came from a source of his. Most of, a lot of the sources I got for fascism came out of Black Shirts and Reds, and I went back and read them all. I had already read Dimitrov and a couple of them, but I hadn't read Dutt until after. I hadn't read Togliatti and stuff. So, I got, he definitely does a lot of sourcing, so I wasn't sure what that what that meant. But please tell me if anyone else has noticed that he doesn't source things right. One book he references here in this chapter is called Robber Barons by Matthew Josephson. It was written in 1934. It's actually pretty it's an interesting book. I've seen the book being used before and stuff like that. So I took it out over the weekend and I read like the 2 last chapters because that's pretty much where Parenti was pointing to on his stuff. But I think I'll go back and read the whole thing. But I'm bringing this I'm bringing this up too because something really funny happened. Because like of course I always look for the free PDFs and I went and searched for the free PDF. And I'm looking through it. I'm reading what I want to read, and I come across this line, and he's mentioning all these capitalists, and he has a few names, and then he has Vandergrift, and I'm like Vandergrift. I go, I wonder. Like first of all, I got to see if this is a real person. No, I think it was because of scanning in because these are free PDFs. So I think that it just did it that because I cannot find a Vandergrift that was like that would have been akin to this group that he was talking about. And then I was like, oh my God, was he like doing what we would do today in comments, like calling him Vandergrift, like calling Vanderbilt? And I just think that's funny. But I think it was just a scanning error. But I think we should call Anderson Cooper Vandergrift now. I don't know. I'm all for it. All right, let's go into section 3 and listen to that.
Pliable progressives and Red Scares. In the 20th century, wealthy interests continued to look to the federal government to do for them what they could not do for themselves, repress democratic forces and advance the process of capital accumulation. During the 1900-1916 period, known as the Progressive Era, federal laws were enacted to protect consumers and workers from unsafe conditions in such industries as meatpacking, food and drugs, banking, timber, and mining. Often these regulations mandated expensive improvements and safety features that were designed to advantage the strongest companies at the expense of smaller competitors. The individuals who occupied the presidency during that era were faithful collaborators of big business. Teddy Roosevelt, for one, was hailed as a trust buster because of his verbal thrusts against the malefactors of great wealth, yet he was hostile toward unionists and reformers, and invited business magnates into his administration. Neither William Howard Taft nor Woodrow Wilson, the other 2 White House occupants of that period, launched any serious operations against big business. Wilson, a Democrat, railed against giant trusts, but his campaign funds came from a few rich contributors. He worked with associates of Morgan and Rockefeller about as closely as any Republican. Progressivism was not the triumph of small business over the trusts, as has often been suggested, but the victory of big businesses in achieving the rationalization of the economy that only the federal government could provide. 15. The period is called the Progressive Era because of the much publicized but largely ineffectual legislation to control monopolies, and because of the 16th Amendment allowing for a graduated income tax, the 17th Amendment providing for the direct election of U.S. senators, and such dubious electoral reforms as the long ballot and nonpartisan elections. In addition, many states initiated legislation limiting the length of the workday and providing workers' compensation for industrial accidents. Several states passed minimum wage laws, and 38 states enacted child labor laws restricting the age children could be employed and the hours they could work. These enactments, representing long-standing demands by workers, were wrested from a resistant owning class after much bitter and bloody contest. Even so, much of the reform legislation went unenforced or proved ineffectual. Millions toiled 12 and 14-hour days, 6 or 7 days a week. According to government figures, 2 million children had to work in order to supplement the family income. Workers' real wages were lower in 1914 than even during the 1890s. As of 1916, millions worked for wages that could not adequately feed a family. Each year 35,000 were killed on the job, while 700,000 suffered serious injuries and work-related disabilities. World War I brought industry and government ever closer. Large sectors of the economy were converted to war production along lines proposed by business leaders. The war helped quell class conflict at home by focusing people's attention on the menace of Germany's barbarian Huns. Americans were exhorted to make sacrifices for their war effort. Strikes were now treated as seditious interference with war production. Federal troops raided and ransacked Union headquarters and imprisoned large numbers of workers suspected of radical sympathies. In 1918, as the war was winding down, Congress passed the Sedition Act, which mandated a 20-year prison sentence for any disloyal opinion or contemptuous reference to the U.S. government, flag, or constitution. Harsh sentences were dealt out to labor organizers, socialists, and anarchists. Later that year, the U.S. Attorney General proudly told Congress, "Never in its history has this country been so thoroughly policed." 17. During the post-war Red Scare of 1919-1921, the federal government continued to suppress radical publications, violently mistreat strikers, and inflict mass arrests, deportations, political trials, and congressional investigations of political dissidents. The public was treated to lurid stories of how the Bolsheviks were about to invade the United States, and how they were murdering anyone in their own country who could read or write or who wore a white collar. Bourgeois leaders around the world greeted the Russian Revolution of 1917 as a nightmare come true. The workers and peasants had overthrown not only the autocratic Tsar but the capitalist class that owned the factories, mineral resources, and most of the lands of the Tsarist Empire. As Secretary of State Robert Lansing noted, the Russian Revolution was a bad example to the common people in other nations, including the United States. Along with England, France, and 11 other capitalist nations, the United States invaded Soviet Russia in 1917 in a bloody but unsuccessful 3-year attempt to overthrow the revolutionary government, a chapter of history about which most Americans have never been informed. Their jazz age of the 1920s was supposedly a prosperous era. Stock speculations and other get-rich-quick schemes abounded, but the bulk of the population lived under conditions of severe want, often lacking basic necessities. In 1928, Congressman Fiorello LaGuardia reported on his tour of the poorer districts of New York City, "I confess I was not prepared for what I actually saw. It seemed almost incredible that such conditions of poverty could really exist." 20. The stock market crash of October 1929 ushered in the Great Depression, signaling a major collapse of productive forces. Consumer demand could not keep up with production. Employees were not paid enough to buy back the goods and services they produced. As supplies and inventories piled up, businesses cut back on their workforce, intensifying the downward spiral. The job losses only sharpened a decline in the public's buying power, which in turn led to more layoffs, less buying power, and more business shutdowns, bank failures, and investment losses until the entire market crashed. In the Great Depression's first 4 years, 15 million workers lost their jobs and millions lost their retirement savings. There was no national system of unemployment insurance and few pension plans. Farmers lost their farms, crops rotted while millions went hungry. Those lucky enough to still have jobs during the Great Depression of the 1930s faced increasingly oppressive work conditions, speed-ups, wage and salary cuts, and a deterioration in safety standards. In addition, employees endured thought and speech control so intense in some plants that workers never spoke except to ask or give instructions. They often could not question deductions from paychecks, and they were subjected to beatings by strike-breaking Pinkertons and thugs, and to the searches of their homes by company men looking for stolen articles.
Okay. All right. So that was section 3 called Pliable, Progressives, and Red Scares. So Parenti is covering a big period of time in this section, but it is all to show how much our government sided with corporations over people. In Chapter 2, he explains how little the framers of the Constitution thought of the people in how they hated democracy. In the first half of this chapter, Parenti describes how even a man of the people, as president, Jackson was called, still served business over the people. And once again, we have reached men of the people in the progressive era with Teddy Roosevelt and Wilson. To be fair, Teddy actually did try to be more balanced a little bit than the previous and future presidents on labor versus business. He was a beast on foreign policy. He was horrible. He pretty much, started the, like we were in the Philippines and stuff like that. Like just, that. But he did try a little bit, like to with the labor. He was working so Samuel Gompers is the guy that started the American Federation of Labor. I think I'm going to bring him up again anyways. But he was kind of friendly with him, and then Samuel Gompers knew too, like as being the leader of the labor unions, he was playing both sides too. So all right. So the policies made just before and during this time failed to curb monopolies and helped Samuel Gompers, the founder and at that time still president of the American Federation of Labor, AFL, which later gobbled up the CIO to become the union we know as the CIO, promote his watered-down type of unions that worked with management and was anti-communist. So Gompers himself was, he was completely against socialism, and so this is why his union, this is why his union is what won out, because he worked with the capitalists. So, that's why we got that. So, I could go on for hours telling you about different strikes, some of which you would remember hearing about and others that you probably never heard about. This one falls into the second category, not surprisingly, because it is a great show of class solidarity. So, this is some writing I did. So, I was working on some labor history stuff. We had on Historically, we interviewed this guy, Jeff Shirky, who wrote a book called Blue Collar Empire. He was writing about the AFL-CIO and how it was anti-communist, and so he took it from the Red Scare. But I was going to do some background to it and write an article for it. And I was like, well, anti-communism didn't start on day one in 1917. It had to have been around. So I did like this, a lot of research, using newspapers, going through the newspapers to find some of these, some more obscurities. So when I talk about anti-communism myself, it's not, anti-communism is an umbrella term. It's not, it doesn't have to be directed exactly at communists. Like what they were doing with the anarchists when he's mentioning Haymarket Square and stuff like that, that falls under that umbrella because it's basically anti-labor. Like the stuff they were doing was anti-labor, but I don't know, no one ever called it that because can you actually be anti-labor? Like since the get-go, everything that they were doing was against labor. So I just say anything anti-labor is anti-communist too. So, because the communists are for the workers owning the means of production. So let me get into this story. So the 1909 Pressed Steel Car Company strike in McKees Rocks, Pennsylvania, was dubbed by labor leader Eugene Debs as the greatest labor fight in all my history in the labor movement, and the one that probably not many people have heard about. And yet it is little talked about today. The company was owned by Frank Norton Hofstadt. If I remember, I didn't reread all my writing on it, but he had just come into the company with another person, and the other person left. So he had only been there for a few years, but Hofstadt was the owner at the time. And the nicknames given to the place by the locals was the Last Chance and the Slaughterhouse. Tells you exactly what conditions the 6,000 employees of the company worked in. According to the local coroner, there was on average a death a day. Many of these workers were immigrants. There were 16 different languages spoken amongst them, and many of their wives and daughters endured harassment and assaults. Not much could be done if the workers wanted to continue to have employment because McKees Rocks was a company town, meaning most things in the town were run by the same capitalists that employed them. Company towns were just another way of the capitalists held power over their employees. Sure, they sound nice, getting living quarters and having things all right there in the community you work in, but the second you are no longer needed by the company, you're out, and you're out violently. And it is just another form of exploitation from the boss since he benefits from the shops you buy from. Okay, so the strike began in July on a payday where Hofstadt shorted many of the workers and he refused to speak with them. He just kept saying, I'm not going to speak to them. He was speaking to them through, this is why, I use newspapers.com. He was just talking to the media, and he's like, I'm not going to talk to them. They're going to come to work. No doubt I'm going to have enough people working here. This is what he was saying to the, in the media and stuff. It's kind of funny if you follow the whole thing. So he was refusing to speak with them, the workers. So the IWW show up. And, this is how Debs gets involved because he's involved with the IWW at that time. And the IWW show up to help. And the reasons Deb felt the strike was so important was the solidarity among the workers of the 16 different cultures coming together. The solidarity among the immigrants extended beyond fellow workers and into the community. In the initial days, it was just the immigrant workers with the support of their families who started striking. But a few days in, when the call came in to the, to cross the picket lines, the native-born workers, so that they a lot of times when you're reading the history at this time, they'll call someone that was born here native. So that's where it gets like confusing, and probably one reason why Indigenous people don't really don't particularly love Native American either, because they're neither American, and they're not even American at this time either. So the solidarity among the immigrants extended beyond fellow workers and into the community. In the initial days, it was just immigrant workers with the support of their families who started striking. But a few days in is when the call came to cross the picket line, and the native-born workers whom Hofstadt were counting on to cross that picket line didn't come. So when it came about, they thought they would have like at least 3,000 people come. It ended up like 100. They had like 100 people come. They couldn't run it. So this went on because this guy was just being stubborn and all that, and they finally they finally just had to say, like, look, I think it was actually like either the steel company, it was like one of the bigger corporations that were now being hurt because like the railroad, like with Debs is there, so the railroad is getting all involved. But like it was like just this class solidarity that Debs hadn't seen before. Like just to see, the people that were born here who were, at that one point, like they felt like a step above the immigrants, because they did get, a little bit more privilege than the immigrants. They all the workers end up coming together. So, that's what that. So also, I want to mention from this section how it was brought up that the U.S. went into the Soviet Union in 1918 to help the Allied forces, which include Japan, France, and Britain at the time, to stand with the White Army against the Bolsheviks. Parenti is right. It is not well known that we did this. They claim this was to stop the Germans, but it was purely anti-communist, as was the policies written at the time. The anti-communism started well before 1917, like I said. So, as I was looking back, I was seeing mentions. It wasn't so much communists; it was like those French socialists, and it was always like the German in their ideologies and stuff like that. So they were talking about it like that in the media, but it got more and more that it was just like the anarchists, the communists, the socialists, like they were just, and you would see like one story not kind of mention it, and then they would tie it to like some other story too. Like if you just look through the media, you were getting a sense of that even back then. So, all right. So we are going to listen to the last section now. And if anyone wants to come up and discuss, I know there's not tons of people here right now, but if you ever want to, come up and talk about any of this stuff with me, I will stay on longer. That's why I try to do these, like, I want to try to do these like within an hour and a half, but I have time to talk after. So anytime you want to do that, feel free to just request and I'll let you in if you're not a troll. Okay, hold on.
21. The New Deal, Hard Times and Tough Reforms. In 1932, Senator Hugo Black observed, "Labor has been underpaid and capital overpaid. This is one of the chief contributing causes of the present depression. You cannot starve men employed in industry and depend upon them to purchase." 22. Even banker Frank Vandergrift admitted, "Capital kept too much and labor did not have enough to buy its share of things." 23. But most members of the plutocracy blamed the depression on its victims. Thus, millionaire Henry Ford said the crisis came because the average man won't really do a day's work. There is plenty of work to do if people would do it. A few weeks later, Ford laid off 75,000 workers, with a third of the nation ill-fed, ill-clothed, and ill-housed, and easily another third just barely getting by. A torrent of strikes swept the nation, involving hundreds of thousands of workers. Between 1936 and 1940, the newly formed Congress of Industrial Organizations organized millions of workers and won significant gains in wages and work conditions. These victories were achieved only after protracted struggles in which many thousands occupied factories in sit-downs, or were locked out, blacklisted, beaten, and arrested. Hundreds more were wounded or killed by police, soldiers, and company thugs. The gains were real, but they came at a high price. The first 2 terms of President Franklin Roosevelt's administration have been called the New Deal, an era commonly believed to have brought great transformations on behalf of the forgotten man. Actually, the New Deal's prime dedication was to business recovery rather than social reform. First came the National Recovery Administration, which set up code authorities, usually composed of the leading corporate representatives in each industry, to restrict production and set minimum price requirements, with results that were more beneficial to big corporations than to smaller competitors. In attempting to spur production, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation alone lent $15 billion to big business. The federal housing program subsidized construction firms and mortgage bankers, all of little benefit to the many millions of ill-housed. Likewise, the New Deal's efforts in agriculture primarily benefited the large producers through a series of price supports and production cutbacks. Many tenant farmers and sharecroppers were evicted when federal acreage rental programs took land out of cultivation. The slump in consumption and the glut of unbought goods caused a severe drop in prices in many markets, including farm products. To bolster prices, the New Dealers paid farmers to destroy millions of acres of cotton crops, vast wheat reserves, and millions of hogs and piglets. The stark contrast of overabundance and hunger caused many to question the serviceability of capitalism. Food had to be destroyed to save the market. 28. The public outcry caused the White House to form the Federal Surplus Relief Corporation, which bought up large amounts of surplus foods to feed the unemployed. Faced with mass unrest, the federal government created a variety of relief programs that eased some of the privation. But as the New Deal moved toward measures that threatened to compete with private enterprises and undermine low-wage structures, business withdrew its support and became openly hostile. While infuriating Roosevelt, who saw himself as trying to rescue the capitalist system, business opposition enhanced his reformist image in the public mind. The disparity between the New Deal's popular image and its actual accomplishments remains one of the unappreciated aspects of the Roosevelt era. For instance, the Civilian Conservation Corps provided jobs at subsistence wages for only 3 million of the 15 million unemployed. At its peak, the Works Progress Administration and related agencies employed almost 9 million people, but often for unstable duration and grossly inadequate wages. Of the millions who were earning subsistence wages, only about 500,000 were helped by the minimum wage law. The Social Security Act of 1935 covered but half the population and provided paltry monthly payments with no medical insurance or protection against illness before retirement. Unemployment insurance covered only those who had enjoyed sustained employment in select occupations. Implementation was left to the states, which were free to set whatever restrictive conditions they chose. While government programs were markedly inadequate for the needs of the destitute, they helped dilute public discontent. But once the threat of political unrest subsided, federal relief was slashed, and large numbers of destitute people were thrust onto a labor market already glutted with unemployed. The Roosevelt administration's tax policy was virtually a continuation of former President Hoover's program, with its generous loopholes for business. When taxes were increased to pay for military spending in World War II, the major burden was taken up by middle and low-income classes that had never before been subjected to income taxes. All this is not to deny that, in response to enormous popular agitation and the threat of widespread radicalization, the Roosevelt administration produced real democratic gains, including some long-overdue social welfare legislation, a number of worthwhile conservation and public works projects, a rural electrification program, and a reduction in unemployment from 25% to 19%. Millions of hungry and destitute people were fed and sheltered. The steep inequality in income was noticeably eased, thanks to stronger unions, greater regulation of industry, and progressive taxes on corporate profits and wealth. Under Social Security, working people won not only retirement pensions but disability insurance and survivors insurance. The New Deal built or improved roads across the country, and constructed thousands of schools, parks, playgrounds, athletic fields, and airports, along with hundreds of hospitals, post offices, bridges, tunnels, and courthouses. The CCC created 52,000 acres of public campgrounds, built over 13,000-foot trails, and restored almost 4,000 historic landmarks or monuments. It stocked waterways with millions of fish, made important contributions to firefighting, rodent and pest control, water conservation, and preventing soil erosion. Thousands of unemployed writers, actors, musicians, and painters were given modest support and opportunity to enrich the lives of many in performances that ordinary people could afford to attend. Before the Roosevelt era, unions were readily broken by court injunctions, heavy fines, and violent repression. The New Deal produced a series of laws such as the Wagner Act and the Norris-LaGuardia Act to legalize labor's ability to bargain collectively. Management-controlled company unions were banned, and a minimum wage and 40-hour week were established. Congress set up the National Labor Relations Board with broad powers to oversee the certification of unions and penalize employers who violated the organizing rights of workers. Such legislation was both a response and a stimulus to labor's growing organization and militancy. Yet the New Deal era hardly adds up to a great triumph for the common people. They were ready to go a lot further than Roosevelt did, and probably would have accepted a nationalized banking system, a more massive job program, and a national health care system. In regard to desegregation, open housing, fair employment practices, anti-lynch laws, and voting rights for blacks, the New Deal did nothing. Domestics and farm workers, the two most common occupations for African Americans at the time, were excluded from Social Security coverage. African Americans were excluded from jobs in the Civilian Conservation Corps, received less than their proportional share of public assistance, and under the NRA were frequently paid wages below the legal minimum. After the United States entered World War II in December 1941, industrial plant utilization more than doubled. The gross national product, which had stood at $88 billion in 1940, mushroomed to $135 billion within a few years. Those who profited most were the industrial tycoons and arms contractors, but some of it trickled down. Almost all the 8.7 million unemployed were either drafted into the armed forces or drawn back into the workforce, along with 10 million new workers, many of them women. Only by entering the war and remaining thereafter on a permanent war economy was the United States able to significantly reduce unemployment. The ruling politico-economic elites were willing to make the kind of all-out spending effort to kill people in wartime that they would not make to assist people in peacetime. In sum, over the 19th and 20th centuries, government's growing involvement in economic affairs was not at the contrivance of meddling Washington bureaucrats but was a response to the systemic instability and crises of corporate capitalism. Along with the many small labor conflicts handled by local government, there developed large-scale class struggles, which had to be contained by the national government. Government provided the subsidies, services, and protections that business could not provide for itself. The corporate economy needed a corporate state. While the populace won formal rights to participate as voters, the state with its courts, police, and army remained mostly at the disposal of the moneyed class. However, working people were not without resources of their own, specifically the ability to disrupt and threaten the process of capital accumulation by withholding their labor through strikes, and by engaging in other acts of protest and resistance. Such agitation wrested concessions from the owning class and the state. These victories fell short of achieving a social democracy, but they represented important democratic gains for working people. As our history shows, those on the left, liberals, progressives, and radicals, have fought for egalitarian and democratic reforms. They opposed lynching and pushed for laws to abolish child labor. They pushed for the elimination of property qualifications and poll taxes for voting. They supported anti-monopoly laws, women's suffrage, desegregation, the right of workers to unionize, occupational safety, aid to poor families, disability insurance, unemployment insurance, federal pensions, survivors insurance, the right to voice dissenting views, peace movements, and the separation of church and state. In just about every one of these instances, it was the wealthy plutocrats who resisted such reforms and who favored regressive taxes, massive public subsidies to big business, and repressive measures against political dissent and against labor unions.
Okay, so my first statement coming this is the first paragraph had me writing Henry Ford is a piece of shit, full stop, calling workers lazy and that they just didn't want to put in a hard day's work, then laying off 75,000 workers is just peak Ford. Fuck that guy. That's what I wrote on that. But anyhow, I also wanted to bring up too, like he's saying here, like the left, the liberals, the progressives, and the radicals. So really we've lost a lot of the liberal and progressive fight. They have, it's all performative at this point. So I don't know about that. Okay, so I mentioned Gompers in the AFL-CIO a little bit above. The anti-communism that hit labor was another control that the capitalists took. At least with some communists in charge, workers received greater concessions all around, but they did come at a high price. So when he's bringing up CIO, the CIO was not a communist union. It was just led by a communist. And a lot of these unions at the time, not a lot of, I mean, a few of them had communists, socialists, there was anarchists in there, but like they didn't want any of them. And so they actively destroyed unions. I mean, you can look at the history of the IWW and see what they did to them and stuff like that to get them to not have any power at all, because the IWW actually was, creating a lot of class solidarity. They were creating a lot of headaches for the capitalists too. The New Deal didn't help the people as much as it was romanticized to. It was basically a bunch of band-aids offered that were later diminished anyhow. Still to this day, the threat of the removal of some programs are used against the public. Any appearance of democracy in this country came from the people, not our government, who didn't think the people deserved democracy. The Constitution was written without us, without them. None of them wanted the people to have any say. Most of them had to have their arms twist to, add in a House of Representatives, because that was like basically the only thing that people could directly vote for in the federal government at the time, because the senators were appointed. And the Bill of Rights, that was, they didn't want to add all that stuff in, and they had to get it to pass. So the chapter argues that the evolution of the corporate state in America was not merely a result of bureaucratic intervention, but a response to the crises of capitalism, with the government consistently acting in the interest of the wealthy while labor movements fought for democratic reforms. So that's what I have for notes on that. If anyone has any questions, let me know. Or if anyone wants to come up and discuss anything, let me know. Otherwise, I will shut down in a minute or two. So I hope you all are having a lovely evening. I think my anxiety finally broke. I was having like a week's worth of anxiety. I was like high anxiety. So I think I finally got got through that. So I'm a little tired, but yeah, I mean, give me 1 second. Give me a second. I have some notes on that somewhere. Because so mainly one of the big things is there was a bunch of money that went out to the corporations to try to help them too, using that trickle down. So like he does mention that in there, that it was there was the trickle down, and then some did trickle down, and I think he's being a little sarcastic when he says this, like, because they sent the men to war, you know what I mean? So then there was some jobs and there was some money, and then people were doing okay in that, except for there was a bunch of people having to fight a war. So what do we have here? So basically what he needed to do it had to save capitalism, and they realized that the people needed to have a little bit more standing in order to do that. So the what they did at first, giving, feeding the people and all that. So it just, it ends up just helping capitalism. And we talk about this too in anything that we do that just puts a Band-Aid on capitalism is in support of capitalism. Like you're not getting rid of capitalism by bandaging it up and making it stronger, so in like, that's like Parenti's sense of that. But there was a lot of, money given to the corporations. There was a lot of, when they're talking about, I just lost my thoughts. Sorry. Let me just see. So, let me see what's going on in the comments here. So, I will, and Dave, I can look in that and talk a little bit more on it next week and give you direct things to look at. I am doing these two. I'm so right now. Someone's asking. Club president's asking what time of day. I am doing these Tuesdays and Thursdays at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I'm starting them. I say that they go for 2 hours. I will go for longer than that if people want to come up and do longer discussions on it. But I just started last week. I did one. It was earlier in the day, but then I just chose the 7 to 9. I'm also gonna have these up on YouTube for after too. So like if you miss one or you want to like go back and watch one, whatever, it'll be up there. So, all right. Oh, Moxie must have been talking about anxiety because I was talking about anxiety. Sorry, Moxie. I hope you get through it fairly well. It's annoying. All right, Red Spectre. Thank you for coming here. Any other Parenti work I should read before this? This is so he has books on like any subject. Like, so if you want to like look at, fascism, of course it's Black Shirts and Reds, but he has like Face of Imperialism. If you're interested in just like kind of looking at the imperialism, he wrote a book on like media bias. We actually, for Collective and our book and our recommended book reads, Cutie had just has added Inventing Reality, which is, it was written before the Chomsky book, so you can get a lot out of that. So we didn't want to put the Chomsky book up there, so we put the Michael Parenti one. So he wrote like 20 books. So really each of them has kind of their own little theme on it. Like he was a poli-sci professor. That's why he wrote this book when he got blacklisted. He was writing his poli-sci so this was the first edition was written in 1974. All right, so Adriano, the Swedish Union gaslight us into thinking the big deal of 1938 was great for us workers, but it was just the unions becoming best friends with the capital to stop strikes. So you're probably getting the like some of that. I like the Gompers thing. Right around that time in like the early 1910s, Gompers went over to France and so Samuel Gompers is the AFL guy that I was saying that's an anti-communist unionist, right? And he goes over to France and they just basically laughed at him. They laughed him out because he was just like, we have to work with the capitalists, like he didn't like protests. He didn't like any of the strikes. So he was all against that stuff. So yeah, I'm sure like a lot of that stuff comes over. Oh, thank you, Moxie. The Assassination of Julius Caesar is I do enjoy that book. Someone came up and I'm sorry, I can't remember who it was, but we were chatting about it in Ash's Live, and I do like that book because it really comes from the people. It's actually considered a people's history, just like the Zen stuff and all that. I kind of question, like he kind of, I mean, is he too kind to Julius Caesar? I don't know, maybe a little too kind, but I mean, he does come down on him too. But, Julius Caesar wanted more of a democracy and that's not what the senators wanted. So, did y'all talk about the Cuban Revolution last time? What were we talking about the last time? No, because we were talking about the Constitution. and Ash's Live, I think we were talking about Cuban Revolution at one point. So I have talked about Cuban Revolution recently. So Superior manufacturing consent, although, yeah, manufacturing consent. Manufacturing is suiting name for, yeah. I agree, David. Manufacturing consent is a good name. And also Chomsky probably didn't write even half of the book. So every deal, every other year is just concessions to the capitalists. Yeah. And that's like, and you're going to find that like, this is why like the Europeans should be looking towards what is happening in America, because like if they were following, the American form of capitalism, they're going to get some of that. And I know like some of the Soc Dem countries, Yahtzees are getting all in there too. So the workers aren't doing very well. But yeah, so I don't know. Yeah, Julius Caesar is a mixed, mostly bad bag. Yes, I don't feel like Parenti was like, oh, yeah, Parenti doesn't great man him. You know what I mean? But he's trying to say like, if they allowed Caesar to do a couple of things, it would have helped some people, a few people. But it was, it was good. I like the book because it is written kind of from, the people that they didn't care to write about. You know what I mean? It was the people. They didn't care to write about the people and what the people thought and what the people needed and stuff like that. So, all right. Well, I'm going to end it there. And thank you very much all for joining. Like I said, so Tuesdays and Thursdays at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I will be doing these. I'll be doing chapter by chapter. If any of you who like to come up on lives ever want to come up on a live, I am not opposed to having you up and discussing any of this stuff. So if you want to read ahead and you're like, oh, I like this chapter and I have stuff to say, just reach out to me and I will bring you up and you can join in on the discussion. All right, everyone, have a good evening, night, morning, afternoon, wherever you are. I will talk to you later. Bye.